Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. I'm here with my guest, Eric Turkheimer, American psychologist and author of this book. I don't know if people can see it, The Nature-Nurture Debate. And Eric's also got a Substack where he talks about issues relating to genetics and psychology and stuff like that I find very interesting. Is there anything else you think people should know about your background just before we get into the topic?
No, I'm a clinical psychologist, though I don't actually do any clinical work. But that's my background in training.
Great. So Nature-Nurture Debate, it's a book where I guess you broadly explain, broadly explore the nature of sort of genetic explanations, right? So people often in sort of common parlance, when they're interested in explaining why they are who they are, they might kind of lean into saying, it's in their DNA, or I must have a gene for X or something like that. There's this whole debate around that, which has been characterized as, factors that are due to nature, factors that are due to nurture. And we're going to talk about some of the methods and things that go into that. But first, I suppose, do you want to, could you unpack for me maybe the differences that people might have in mind between, say, something like the psychological side of things and maybe something like the biological or genetic side of things, where people might think this is a kind of harder science versus this is like a softer science, So what is there like a distinction between social factors and softer sciences and sort of like harder sciences in your view, and how do they kind of intermingle in this debate?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things to say about that. First of all, even most of the harder science type things, at least many of them, have turned out to be more complicated than anybody anticipated. I mean, the genetics of height is further along than the genetics of personality, but it's still plenty complicated, and the biology is not really unraveled. And for medical things, I mean, cancer genetics has made some strides, but has also run into a lot of obstacles. And so it hasn't really turned anywhere short of single gene disorders like Huntington's disease or something. It's really turned out to be much more complicated than anybody thought. But beyond that, I think the big distinction is between traits, we'll say traits in plants or animals, where it's possible to do all kinds of biological experimentation to follow up whatever kind of genetic correlations are found that allow a certain kind of rigorous science, whereas in people, you can observe that people with certain kinds of personalities to some extent have certain kinds of genes, but it's very hard to go anywhere farther than that because you can't breed people and you can't dissect people and you can't do knockout gene experiments on people. And so we have a tendency to, that kind of human behavior is the most complicated thing scientists ever try to study. And we have to do it with our hands tied behind our back because there's so many things that for obvious good ethical reasons we can't do.
So there's two parts maybe to the claim there, which would be that human behavior is like one of the most complicated things to study, right? Like it's much more complicated than a lot of these other domains where we might be messing about with genes or animal behavior or something like that, and that the ethics make it difficult to study. Is that right?
Right. That it still is to some extent, but especially 20 or 30 years ago when people were focusing on studying twins, papers always began with, well, we're going to use twins to, the word that was always used, to disentangle nature and nurture. And I think what turned out is that you can't disentangle them. Again, in humans, especially because you might be able to say, if you could do something horrible, like clone one of us and raise one of us in this kind of pen and one of us in that kind of pen, well, maybe you could say something, and that would disentangle nature and nurture. That's how you do it. But in humans, they're inherently entangled.
I wonder then, so even in that distinction, right, of nature versus nurture, the idea of saying that there is a nature to a person and that that nature can kind of like explain who they are. I mean, what kinds of things do biologists have in mind there when they make that sort of claim? Because, you know, is it the idea that the person's like encoded in their genes, like that's the essence of them or something, or is it something else?
I think I mean, first of all, I think biologists are less likely to make that claim than behavioral scientists are, because I think biologists are more aware of the difficulties of establishing actual biological mechanisms in organisms, and have some experience with actually doing it in corn or rats or something. So I think those claims that we have an inner biological nature are much more likely to come from behavioral scientists, behavior geneticists like me, sociobiologists in a slightly different domain. And I think there's a tendency for scientists to do that for some understandable and not especially malevolent reasons, and then some bad ones. I mean, I think scientists are always motivated to believe that the science that they're doing has real implications for the real world, in this case, real people. And it turns out that actually doing science on human behavior is so hard that a lot of the time it's very hard to get to a place where we feel like we're doing that. And so it's always so tempting to say, oh, genetics has revealed that different people have different capacities for IQ or different risks for depression or whatever it is. Even when that's not the case. And unfortunately, what then happens is that when people make those claims out of kind of innocent scientific enthusiasm, they get picked up by, I mean, worst case scenario, eugenicists, or people who believe that some people are inferior because of their genes, or superior, and it's very hard to have one without the other. It's very hard to believe that the genetics of behavior is doing something important without licensing really bad use of that by badly motivated people.
So, I mean, I will get around to questions that are sort of like more scientific in nature, but just in terms of then, I suppose, do you think that this domain of inquiry is almost something like essentially political to some degree, because people are in the business here of trying to sort of explain why people are the way they are, and you know those questions don't exist in a vacuum or something. Like they're trying to explain why people are the way they are for some goal or something, like whether it's to talk about how we should organize society or how they should think of themselves or conceptualize other people. Do you think, or do you think that like the scientific questions here are more politically neutral ever?
No, I don't think they are. I don't know that they can be politically neutral. I mean, there's been some interesting work lately that maybe we can talk about from my student Paige Harden to suggest that the political consequences aren't as simple as people have sometimes thought they are. But I mean, yes, going back to Francis Galton in the late 19th century, who was sort of the grandfather of all this, people Well, look at either individuals or societies, but let's start with societies. Look at the structure of society and say, well, some people are up and some people are down, and some people are successful and some people are unsuccessful, and some people are rich and some people are poor. And is this, to some extent, the result of the natural biological order of things? And to the extent that you believe that it is, you are putting a biological stamp of approval on the socioeconomic status quo. And I think what makes it very hard, and this is a theme of the book, I mean, if it had sort of worked out that all those old Victorian, very politically regressive people had thought that the world was justified by biology and genetics, but then fortunately we became enlightened and found out how to really study genetics in human beings, and now we know that genetics doesn't have anything to do with the kind of outcomes that people have. That would be a very nice world, but it doesn't really work out that way. Genetics does have something to do with outcomes for people in the world. I think you have to be crazy not, I mean, never mind the science, anybody can see that I mean, at the extreme, some people are born with all kinds of genetic conditions that are going to prevent them from succeeding in society. And so, again, a lot of the book is about sorting that out. How can you acknowledge a certain amount of genetic realism about why people differ from each other without following that all the way down to either older or newer versions of poor people are poor because they have genes that make them poor.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. So, in terms of the methods of explanation then that are involved in the nature nurture debate, you go through a bunch of different methods that people apply in the book. I wonder if at first you could talk about some of the sort of early attempts to use variance and ANOVA to sort of like explain sort of heritable differences in people and the limitations of those methods, and then we can go on to sort of, I guess, how they were improved upon and where we've got to now.
improved upon in some ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting history, and something some people don't love about the book is that a lot of it happens 100 years ago. You know, it's not, a lot of it is not about the new modern shiny science of genetics. But again, going back to Francis Galton, who was a polymath and in his own way a genius, he, what, you know, if you get back to that problem of why do people differ in the world, well, he more or less invented the way that you can quantify the question of at least how much do people differ in the world, which is the statistical concept of variance. Which, you know, if everybody was exactly 5'10", the variance of height would be 0, but it's some amount more than that because we're different heights. And you can build a very elegant little statistical theory that Galton and his followers built around the analysis of variance, which is to say, breaking up the differences among people into different sources. So people differ, and it's very tricky here to stay away from sounding like you understand more about what's causing what than we actually do. But people who are in the same family, the variance of their height is less than the variance of the general population of height because they're raised in the same family. And people who are identical twins are almost exactly the same height. They barely vary in height at all. And whereas people who are second cousins are detectably similar in height, but not really very much. And you can use all that to put together a very elegant spreadsheet of what are called sources of variance. And that theory was developed more or less at the same time as the earliest days of what's now called quantitative genetics, which involves doing analysis of variance on the genetic relatedness among people and coming up with precise statistical estimates of how your genetic relatedness with family members is associated with your observable, how your height and your personality or whatever. And we're still doing it. I mean, even when we get to the modern methods based on DNA, in many ways, we're still doing analysis of variance.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that analysis of variance would lead to an understanding of biology. That even though that it would be a replacement for those breeding experiments that we can't do, that we would be able to make the same inferences based on natural variation out there that we're not intervening on than we can if we're raising animals in pens and breeding them intentionally. And it's taken, I think, 100 years to sort out how badly the analysis of variance works as a way to elucidate biology. It's not that it doesn't work at all, but it's the kind of thing that is very elegant and very clean as long as you make some very strict assumptions about it. And those strict assumptions are almost impossible to make in human beings. So, for example, that the genes you have are uncorrelated with the environment that you're raised in. The whole method depends on that assumption. And in animals, we can guarantee it via experimental control. But in people, of course, that doesn't obtain. And like so much human science, what turns out is that the consequences of the assumptions turn out to be bigger than the causal effects of the things that you're trying to study.
Would I be right? Tell me if my understanding is kind of off here, because again, this isn't my field or anything. But is it sort of almost as simple in terms of people's intuition as like a correlation causation type thing, where you might be saying, well, look, in our statistical construct, this much of a change in this variable accounts for this much of a change in that variable. And so as a statistical explanation, you've got an explanation there, right? But in terms of like a causal model or a mechanistic model, it's right that what I've called gene statistically accounts for this much of a change statistically. But then to make the claim causally, biologically, that, gene causes or explains these kind of things, that it doesn't necessarily connect through to the thing that you're seeing in the statistics there. Is that broadly right, or is there more or less?
That's exactly right. And once again, if you're studying rats and you observe that correlation, you can then go to the lab and do experiments in order to use the correlation as a hint, go to the lab and establish the causation there. And that's exactly what you can never do in people.
Right. So could you talk a little bit about, I think I'm going to say it, I don't know if you pronounce it ACE or ACE studies. And
ACE.
yeah, what are they and what do they show?
Well, the field of quantitative genetics, which was founded by R.A. Fisher in 1918, is exactly about doing analysis of variance on genetics. And it's a very, even Fisher's original paper is it's very sophisticated math. And so it's not just how much variance is attributable to genes from families, but then questions like, well, what if mothers and fathers are correlated for the trait? How does that affect the variance? And what if, like I said a minute ago, genetic differences and environmental differences are correlated with each other? Or what if there's an interaction between them? Or you can keep spinning it. And you can use the math to derive, at least on a statistical level, very precise estimates of all of that. Fast forward to the 1980s. So we haven't really talked about twins yet, and I think that's
Sure, yeah, we
important.
can bring that. Yeah,
In human beings, the most powerful tool for doing that kind of quantitative genetics is twins. Twins are an amazing scientific tool. Most mammals don't have identical twins. Human beings happen to, and it's this amazing thing that there are clones among us in the world, and that's an incredible tool for understanding genetics, to look and see what happens in clones. And then even more than that, or along with that, we also know that siblings and fraternal twins, who are just siblings, share on average exactly 50% of their DNA. And so we can say with precision that's unheard of in the human sciences that identical twins are genetically twice as similar as fraternal twins, who are exactly twice as similar as half siblings, who are exactly twice as similar as cousins, etc. So for the really 100 years between Galton and the Human Genome Project, human behavior genetics mostly proceeded by studying identical and fraternal twins. And the ACE model is a simplified, it's quantitative genetics made as simple as you can possibly make it, for people who are studying human beings, don't have control over the environment, don't have control over the genetics, the breeding. And it turns out, with a little high school algebra and a million assumptions that are kept in the background, that twice the difference in similarity between identical and fraternal twins. I don't know if your audience know how to think in terms of correlations.
yeah, they should be pretty okay with most stuff, I think.
So if identical twins are correlated 0.9 for height, and fraternal twins are correlated 0.5, 0.9 minus 0.5 is 0.4. Double it, you get 0.8, and 80% is the easy peasy proportion attributable to genetics. And that's called A, which stands for additive for reasons that we don't necessarily have to get into. But it's the genetic part. And then C and E are these two environmental parts. C stands for common and is the variance that is attributable to being raised together in the same family with your siblings. It's the family effect, the environmental family effect. And E is everything else. It gets called the non-shared environment, which is not a very good name, but that refers to things that happen in a family to make you different from your siblings. Everything. And the ACE model, which you can do in your head without DNA and without any environmental measures. You give identical twins the Turkheimer personality questionnaire, correlate the MZ and DZ twins, and bang, you're done. Happening at about the same time that desktop computers were becoming widely available, turned every psychologist in the world into a quantitative geneticist. And so from, say, the 70s through 2000 or so, thousands upon thousands of twin studies were done of about everything. And because it was easy. A, it was easy, and B, in a way that was very useful to genetically oriented scientists, they all came out the same way. They identical twins turn out to be more similar than fraternal twins for everything. For everything from height to intelligence to personality to random lists of questions that don't have anything to do with each other, to how much TV you watch, whether you prefer sweet or salty snacks. Identical twins are always, always more similar. And so, proceeding toward the end of the last century, it was starting to look as though the human world was far more genetic than anybody had anticipated. Everything was genetic. IQ was genetic, and therefore the bell curve happened. And every mental illness anybody could think of to study was genetic in this sense, and that transformed psychiatry. And all those questions that we started with about why is the structure of the social world the way it is, it was looking like Galton is right. It's the way it is because of genes.
Would I be right in thinking? I mean, like, feel very free to challenge this because it's just a sort of assertion that maybe that there's also perhaps effects in these papers, such as like publish or perish culture, the publication bias, wanting to find like positive results, and kind of people just being the ease, I guess, generally of applying the methodology that would just make it, if you're a researcher or an academic, very easy and very incentivized to just kind of create papers like this, churn them out, and contribute to the body of knowledge.
Yes, but in a particular sense. I mean, yes, that's true. And I write in the book about how science is such a risky business and it takes so much commitment and time and effort to get a study out. If you know ahead of time what's going to happen and that it's going to support your point of view, it makes you super motivates you. But I don't think it sometimes in that when somebody says something like that it's motivated scientists with publication pressure, there's an implication that the studies that don't work out the way you want them to are getting stuffed in a drawer somewhere. And in this case, I don't really think that's true. I'm trained as a twin researcher, and I've been involved in hundreds of twin analyses. And I'm a skeptic about the whole business, but I have never seen a twin analysis come out where fraternal twins were more similar than identical twins. Never once. It
Yeah.
And that's a way that I differ from some of the strongest
Skeptics.
critics of behavior genetics. That I don't think anybody's making this up. That's a fact about the world, that identical twins are more similar than anybody else. And we can ask all sorts of questions about why and what it means, but as a raw empirical fact, it's always true.
Yeah. So the criticism then from your point, so the criticism from your point of view isn't that this shows that these sorts of studies aren't showing us anything. At maybe the lowest level resolution way of explaining it is like it's kind of like a murky looking glass or something. So what are those limitations then in your view? Given it's getting at something that's there, but what are the limitations, and how do we get past those limitations?
Well, I don't know that we can, to answer your last question first.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's one classical objection to the idea of twin studies, which is that for them to make any sense at all, you have to assume that the reason identical twins are so similar is because of their genes and not because their parents treat them alike and dress them alike and they look alike. It's called the equal environments assumption. And that is like I say, that people who object to twin studies and the genetic conclusions they lead to, that's always their first line of defense. And I don't disagree. I mean, identical twins are treated more similarly than fraternal twins. But to me, that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's one reason that these things are not genetic in a straightforward way. But there are a lot more complicated. They're harder to talk about. So at the very end of the book, I talk about something I call outcomes, which are complicated human characteristics that are obviously, I think, to everybody, not simply a direct manifestation of anything genetic about someone. So let's try whether you're a liberal or a conservative. Everybody knows we don't have liberal and conservative genes. But identical twins are more similar in political attitudes than fraternal twins are. Mm-hmm. And how does that happen? That, well, this is hard to describe out loud, but your political point of view is the end point of this really long developmental process that started when you were a child and maybe in some ways started when your brain was developing in the womb, for that matter, through the friends you had and what your parents thought and what happened to you in school and what your first political experiences were, and finally winds up somewhere. And I think what turns out is that at every step in that chain, your genes nudge you in one direction or another, to make you more conventional versus nonconformist, or to make you more intellectual versus intuitive, or to make you more easily disgusted with. And the net effect of all those little nudges, none of which really have anything to do with each other, is to wind up making identical twins similar.
Mm.
But that happens without there being anything resembling a liberal gene or a specifiable genetic process that we could ever understand that makes some people liberal and some people conservative. Our genes place a constraint on our development that makes it more likely that we wind up in some places than others.
So I have a question about that of reasoning it through is, I guess, what's the difference here really between someone who feels more comfortable saying, it's the genes that are causing those differences versus kind of like positing that it's a little bit more probabilistic, but it's still, in terms of your explanation, there's kind of a dependency on the gene at the bottom of it. And then there's kind of like a sort of stochastic process where it's not guaranteed. And so maybe it's a bit more accurate and a bit more loose, but is that the structure of the explanation is pretty much the same?
Part of it is that having a strong view of it turns out to be very dependent on talking about identical twins. And most of us don't have identical twins. So if you have an identical twin, I mean, an identical twin is not really a predictor because they're your contemporary. But if you allow yourself to think of it as a predictor, it's a great predictor. And you can sort of think that, yes, your development as a person is strongly constrained by the development of your identical twin.
Okay.
But that breaks down very rapidly as you go from identical twins to first degree relatives, where those kind of effects are still observable, to second degree relatives, where you'd better get a statistician, to beyond that. And this is a very important transition here where you can't see it at all. And what that really brings us to is the DNA revolution.
So just before the DNA revolution, though, just to make sure I'm clear on what you're saying, so are you saying that the main difference here is coming from the fact that people will treat identical twins different to like fraternal twins, different to cousins, sort of thing?
Well, and also it's not just that. Even on a genetic level, it's that being a clone enforces genetic similarity in a way that being half a clone does not. It's not a linear process.
Mm.
And well, I'm back to wanting to get to
feel free.
Part.
Yeah, feel free. Don't worry.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, here's what happened, right? After all these twin studies showed that everything was genetic, around 2000, all of a sudden the human genome was sequenced. And since that time, getting genomic data on individual people has gotten easier and easier and cheaper, till now it's totally easy. And everybody assumed that, wow, this is great. I mean, twins showed us that IQ is heritable, and now we're going to find the IQ genes and the schizophrenia genes. And another way of saying the same thing, to make a bridge between my 2 points, is now that we're not going to use identical twins anymore, we're going to be able to understand not only why I'm alike and different from my siblings, an identical twin, but why I'm alike and different from you, to whom I'm not obviously genetically related. I mean, we share DNA, but and this was going to be the great revolution in human behavior genetics. And I don't want to oversell my case here and make myself an outlier. To say that it has turned out to be more difficult to do that than anybody expected would be an understatement. I'll say it that way. We to this day basically don't have a meaningful gene for a complex human behavior of any kind. So, I mean, there are genes related to IQ in the sense that there are deleterious genes of large effect that impair brain function, and we've known about those for a long time. But as like a gene that makes people smarter, we've spent now 25 years searching and haven't found it. And mostly the same well, yes, I'm completely the same for personality, mostly the same for psychiatry. And what does that mean? What that means is that that genetic tendency for cloned MZ twins to be similar breaks down at the level of you and me. That we can't identify any genetic processes that make you more extroverted than I am. And that's the great puzzle of the field today. It's something called the missing heritability problem. That there was all this heritability out there. Have we used that word yet? Heritability is for that A term, the proportion of variance attributable to genetics. And, there it was sitting out there, 50, 60, 70%. And then finally we get our hands on the DNA and we're going to find out what makes everything so damn heritable. And there's nothing there. Not nothing, almost nothing. And that's And to right now, that's just an enormous mystery that I can't explain it. I mean, there are people on one side, the super critics, who want to say, well, that just shows that the twin studies were wrong all along.
Hmm.
And it was all the equal environments, but I don't really think that's true. Like, I've been around too many identical twins to think that. And then there are the sort of optimists on the other side who think, well, we haven't gotten there yet, but the science will advance surely, and it's always the light at the end of the tunnel. But
So am I right just in thinking then? So from the twin studies, and you combine that with what we believe we know about genetics, and so you would think that when we're able to essentially swap out what the twins identical or fraternal stand in for, naively is basically a set of genes, right? And so the idea is that when it becomes very easy for us to actually say what those genes are, we'll just see the exact same relationships expressed again. And then are you saying, but when that became very easy to do, we don't see that anymore? Instead, we see just a whole lot of weirdness that we didn't expect to see. There's no kind of easy groupings of genes, individual or even multiple, or there is, but the relationships are far looser than they are in the heritability studies.
what we tend to find is thousands upon thousands of genes, or at least, or something called SNPs, actually, which are subunits of genes, which is the way that actually gets studied, and thousands of them that have little tiny associations with intelligence or personality or schizophrenia. I mean, tiny, 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 tiny associations that there's so many and they're so small that they're sort of uncountable. It's this. I mean, the same ones do turn up from study to study, but nobody ever knows what they mean. Or a lot of them are in non-coding regions of the genome. It's always been another one of those assumptions that we would be able to take all this information and put it together to understand some real biology, but that's still pie in the sky.
So is even saying sort of like it's these 1,000 genes like are very good predictors of this type of thing? Is even that like beyond what we've really got?
Yeah, because they're mostly not very good predictors.
Okay.
So
Collectively, that is not just like
they're not.
individually.
I mean, one way the science has gone has been to add all the little tiny genes together to get a what's called a polygenic score that you can use to predict things. And this kind of moving along in time, 5 years ago, that it was that was going to really rescue the field, and really, and it's worked pretty well for height. We can predict height from genomic data pretty. Still hasn't led to much understanding of the biology of height, but as a raw predictor, it works pretty well. But for intelligence, say, the psychological things that people have always wanted to be able to predict, it's never worked very well. And in the most recent years, it's had a very funny thing has happened. We've gotten, as biologists, have gotten better and better and better at estimating these things precisely. Their ability to predict things has gone down.
Okay.
That as there are all sorts of interesting. Once you're studying DNA, you can separate out some of those equal environment association type of confounds that are just theoretical things in twins. There's nothing you can do about them. But with DNA, you can actually control them. And every time they control for something, the predictive effect of the variables goes down again. Until, I mean, there was just, I think the most recent post on my Substack was a study, I mean, the most carefully controlled study of this kind of genetics for both physical and behavioral characteristics conducted by the absolutely leading genetic, biological, and social geneticists in the world, and believers. They're not skeptics like me. And these predictors finally converged on zero. They didn't do anything at all. So I don't know. It just mentioned because it's interesting. I mean, it's just it's interesting because it's something that this kind of genomics turns out to be very good at. If you think about well, one of the poster children for this kind of effort is educational attainment for a variety of reasons. It's sort of like people do height and then they do educational attainment. And if you think about why genes would be associated with educational attainment, they're sort of the real intuitive genetic way that maybe there are genes that cause people to sprout neurons and give them better brains that help them think better. But then there are all sorts of other reasons too, that if there are genes that for one reason or another are associated with having parents with a lot of money who can send you to private school, that's going to wind up associated with there are all sorts. This is uncontrolled. There are all sorts of
genes for being born in America, industrialized economy or something.
Yes, exactly. They say, well, it's an Americanism, but the zip code that you're born in, your postal address, and those things are all related to genetics, and they're all going to get factored into the equation. But what if instead of studying the difference between you and me, you do it within families and study the difference between pairs of siblings who grew up with the same parents in the same zip code? Then you're controlling for all those parental effects. And what happens? The predictive effect of the genes goes down by like 75% in sibling pairs.
That's not what I would expect intuitively, so that's weird to me.
Why not?
I guess I would have thought it because you're controlling for the environment there, that the genes would have more of an effect.
Yeah, but those environment in study 1, where you're doing it at the population level across families, those environmental effects are getting mistaken for genetic effects. That's what's happening.
Okay. So they're coming out in the analysis as genetic effects.
Right.
Okay, that makes
And then another kind of study, which I just mentioned because it's cool. You inherit half your DNA from each parent, and you inherit half of each parent's DNA, which means you don't inherit half of each parent's DNA. So you can, just like you can predict your educational attainment from the DNA inside your own body. You can predict your educational attainment from the DNA you didn't inherit that's still up there with your parents. And it turns out that predicts EA pretty well too, educational attainment. And when you control for that pushes it down still farther. And that's what happened in that recent study I was describing, that they're the best quantitative geneticists in the world, and they controlled for all this stuff really, really rigorously, and there wasn't anything left.
Right.
And again, I that doesn't lead me to come here and say, oh, and now we can finally see that genes don't have anything to do with the kind of people we become, because I don't think that's true. They turn out not to have anything very systematic to do, right? That something that you can add up into a linear equation and make a prediction from.
So I wonder then, where do you think that this sort of leaves the field of behavioral genetics? So, do you think that, I mean, this is more a kind of subjective opinion thing, but it's like, do you think that we should continue pursuing research in that direction, or what would we even expect, right? If we did, or how could we ever know if actually this is just that the systems involved in the things that we care about explaining are just too complicated beyond genetics, and we should sort of just be content with that, or be doing, I don't know, sociological analyses or political analyses or something instead. So where does that leave us with respect to trying to
I
have?
think we should, I certainly think we should keep doing research. We should always keep doing science, but I think we should allow these results to make us very humble about what we're going to be able to figure out. That I don't think that we are ever going to have a systematic genetic explanation of why some people are smarter than others, because I just don't think human development works that way. And in addition, we insist that it doesn't work that way because we don't allow people to be brought up under controlled conditions. Now, does that mean that there's a secondary way, a humbler way to think about genetics and behavior that doesn't require big dramatic explanations, that I think is useful and necessary? That one thing that people used to do, and some still do, because human science is so hard, is you could do a study, say, well, why do some kids do better in the third grade than other kids? Say, well, it turns out that parents who talk to their children in longer and more complex sentences have children who do better in the third grade, which is true. And therefore, we should be training parents to be more linguistically complicated, and there's an obvious flaw with that study, which is that to the extent those parents and children are biologically related, there's a genetic pathway, even if you don't understand anything about it, which we don't, there's a genetic pathway between those two things. And in fact, if you do the same experiment in adoptive families, you don't find the effect. And so when social scientists do what we do and try and understand the way the human world works on the basis of non-experimental, observing complex correlations among a myriad things, you should be aware of all the reasons why things go together, correlate with each other, and genetics is one of those reasons. And I think we can do better studies of non-genetic things by taking genetics into account. And that's both twins. I've done a lot of twin studies of why identical twins are different. And that controls for genetics because they're genetically identical. And there was a lot of hope in the early days that DNA genetics was going to be able to do that without the twins, because if we have a measure of your genetics and my genetics, and then something about our environment, it's useful to control for our genetics when studying the environment. I think that's run into trouble because the polygenic measures don't work very well. But in principle, so I think of genetics as a way to do old-fashioned social science a little bit better than we used to do it. And if that's not a lot, because social science is a very difficult thing, and we don't have a great track record of coming up with amazing explanations of social problems. And I wish I could be as enthusiastic as all my colleagues that, when the golden day dawns, that we understand the genetics of depression that'll allow us to develop give us drug targets that. but I don't think it's going to happen, because I think depression is much more one of those complicated behavioral outcomes than it is some genetic essence down in us that we're going to be able to unlock.
Do you think that the question of nature versus nurture still makes sense as like a conceptualization? And if not, is there like a more fruitful way of thinking about it that you would advocate for? Like a more fruitful way of thinking about the question that we actually care about there?
Well, no, I don't think old-fashioned nature versus nurture is a very good way to think about it, because it oversimplifies it. A problem. I'm not a very good simplifier of things, and I think the reader comes away from my book with a sense of maybe appreciation of the complexity of this problem that I think is a good outlook, but which I don't know that it supplies a good handy dandy alternative to the analysis of variance in A, C, and E. I sort of wish that it could, but I think that's why the book ends more in moral philosophy than it does in empirical science, because I don't know that there's any substitute for that in thinking about human behavior. And what behavioral scientists have always wanted was to be able to replace moral philosophy, using that term very broadly, in all its squishiness and non-cumulativeness and all the things that are frustrating about non-scientific approaches to people, and replace them with real science. And I personally don't think it's possible. And in fact, attempts to make it possible almost always lead someplace very bad. I mean, eugenics being the most famous example, because there's no way to have a good moral world for human beings that includes scientific determinism. They're antithetical. And my critics would say that I want to deny science because I don't like the ethical outcomes, but that's not right. That, to me, it's that ethical constraints that we all accept, that you can't breed humans, you can't raise us in cages, you can't dissect us, that those make that kind of that accepting that ethical world means accepting a world in which we don't have rigorous scientific explanations of why human beings do what they do.
Right, interesting. So, and I appreciate as well, actually, in terms of the time. Let me know if you have to go.
Yeah, I need to be off in 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, okay. So, yeah, it's almost like, is it the world that gives rise to these sorts of concerns and questions? If you replaced that with a world where humans were sort of a part of experimental setup that would allow you to get at these questions in these sorts of ways, I don't know, is the concern something like that would be a world where the questions that we were asking in the first place about what makes us human in this way or that would kind of cease to, because we'd be reduced to something? Or am I going down a wrong
path? No, I think that's exactly right. that and that to me is, it's exactly, I mean, the broad term for what we're saying here is eugenics. And I mean, eugenics has a specific meaning of the way it was instantiated in the early 20th century. But I think more broadly, eugenics means naturalizing humans in a scientific frame instead of in a humanistic one. And
or giving that precedence maybe over the
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
you.
No.
Well, just my thought from reading the book and I guess listening to it, interviewing you, this past hour, is maybe something like our concerns in engaging with this science broadly seem to be something like engaging in this debate and engaging in the science is something like, how do we control and manipulate the world, and what is it possible for us to control and manipulate about people with respect to behavioral outcomes. So it might be the case that we want to improve educational outcomes, or we want to stop what we consider to be disordered behaviors or something like that. But so one way of doing that might be to say the things we can't control are nature and the things we can control are nurture or something. But that's kind of our concern overall. And then, for any of those things where we care about these sorts of explanations, we're always making a sort of evaluation of, well, this is like a bad behavior to change, or this is a good behavior to change. So it's kind of like the inquiry is connected to our values in that way or something. I wonder, that's at least what I'm thinking. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, just as a...
Yeah, I mean, because that's always the first problem with eugenics is somebody has to decide what the goals are for human behavior. And, and for whatever reason, the first thing that tends to occur to people is, oh, let's make people with higher IQs. And people are good at convincing themselves that that's just a simple rational decision, sort of, let's make people healthier or something. But it's not. It's a value judgment. And so you're not saying, let's make people more honest or more caring or more ethical or more loving. I mean, somebody is picking that. And then in addition, to make any progress, you have to constrain the most basic human freedoms of who gets to reproduce with who. And and as soon as you do that, you're not living in a human world anymore. And well, it's a hard thing to talk about, but I mean, I do. If you imagine the dystopic world where we were doing, we want to know why some people drink more than others, and so we say, okay, we're going to randomly assign babies to alcoholic and non-alcoholic parents and see what happens. Could we learn something? Yes, probably. But we don't want to live in a world in which that's possible. And the pathways that people find to alcoholism in that world where somebody is assigning you to your parents would be different than the ones that we live in now, where we all have to find our way freely to what our attitudes about alcohol are.
Right, because that you've changed the sort of like world so much by what would be required that the findings don't actually have the use that they would have had initially. Interesting. Yeah. Well, we're out of time, so I appreciate you coming on and going over a little bit. Obviously, the book, is there a best place for people to buy it from your point of view, or just wherever they can get it?
I mean, the easiest is Amazon. I sort of hate to say it. It's available from the publisher, and anybody who is my age with questionable eyes. It's a, I don't know if you can tell when you hang it up. It's a real pocketbook.
Yeah, it's
I mean, it's great to stick in your backpack, but it's also small print. So if you're like me, you might think about the Kindle version where you
great.
can make the print bigger.
And there's your Substack as well. Is there anywhere else that you'd want me to point people to where they can find your work or anything?
Really, I mean, I use Blue Sky mostly to publicize my Substack. So I'm on Blue Sky, both about work and just for silly social media things sometimes. But that's it. And I sort of hope to be doing more. I'm not that far from retirement from the university. So I'd love to build my Substack platform a little bit. So I'll be doing more of that. So watch me there.
Great. Well, thanks for your time. Yeah, appreciate you replying to a random email and coming on. So,
well, it's a pleasure. I like doing it.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Yep. And I don't know if we're still recording here, but when are you going to post this?
Well, we've been streaming it as we've been going along.
Oh, we have. Okay.
So
Would you send me a link?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Great. Okay.
We'll end the
Great.
stream there.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.